Today on Locked On Canadians, we discuss whether it's time to hit the panic button, whether we're going to need to at all, and just how good are Juraj Slafkovsky and Lane Hutson really? The answer might surprise you.
You are Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Locked On Canadians. I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. As you know, we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and now the number one sports podcast network. I love saying that, and it's all thanks to you guys. My name is Laura Saba, also known as the Active Stick, and if you're an everydayer, you do know that I normally have my wonderful co-host Ian Boisvert, also known as Maybe It's Ian, joining me, but today he is off. It is American Thanksgiving. He will be back for our Monday episode, and in fact, because he is off, he's actually going to be able to watch today's Vegas Golden Knights game, which I will not be able to do because I will be at work. I might catch the third period. I might make it home in time for the third period. So that's really what we have to hope for. But he's going to watch the whole game. And obviously, we will be covering that game. So I'll find a way to watch it before we record our episode on Sunday. Today's episode is an all-listener mailbag episode. We've got a couple of IRL questions, actually, which I'm really, really excited about. We're going to talk about whether or not we need to hit the panic button at all, particularly when it comes to goaltending. We're going to talk about some fun questions we got asked. We got asked a question about the Montreal Victoire. But first, I received a really interesting question about Juraj Slafkovsky and Lane Hutson. Now, this came from an IRL work friend of mine, and it came in response to, he initially sent me a Reddit thread, which was really funny. And the title of the Reddit thread was, "After watching Logan Cooley and Juraj Slafkovsky, I now know who should have been picked first in the 2022 NHL draft." And then when you click on the thread, the answer is it's Lane Hutson. And I thought that was really funny. But I was reading the comments, and so was my work friend, and he asked me to discuss this on the podcast. And it was a comment saying that Juraj Slafkovsky and Lane Hutson are going to end up being better than Max Pacioretty and PK Subban. And I thought that was really interesting because I don't think they're necessarily the same kind of players, but he did ask me to kind of discuss it on the show. So that's what we're going to talk about right up first. So the one thing I will get out of the way is that in his rookie season, Lane Hutson surpassed the maximum point total that PK Subban had received ever in his NHL career in any season, right? Including the one in which he took home the Norris Trophy. Now, that's just an on-paper thing, right? These are two players that do share quite a lot of similarities, but have also like extremely fundamental differences. And I think that it is tough to kind of make a comparison, but I do like the idea of having that, like, oh, it's the, Max Pacioretty, the large guy, the large winger, right, on the top line. And then Lane Hutson, who's your like either your number one defenseman or your number two defenseman, playing alongside a large guy. So I did kind of like the combination. And I feel like there's like a philosophical idea surrounding the Montreal Canadiens that we can also kind of discuss. I do want to get into Max Pacioretty really quickly. Max Pacioretty was a player who had a hard time in Montreal. There were a lot of knocks on him. There were a lot of issues on him. I remember like the prevailing narrative when he was here being that he was just a peripheral player, right? Like he did not use his physical gifts in the way that he should have. Like people were looking for a power forward, and he was a large man who played forward, right? And I think that it's unfortunate in that it kind of negates, and also he was the captain of the Montreal Canadiens during a time where they were not an exciting team. They were not a team that really had a whole lot of promise. And when they did, it got Chris Kreider. So I think like there's a lot of pressure on him for that reason. Like Max Pacioretty comes with built-in pressure, and he did not live up to that. So Juraj Slafkovsky comes with a different kind of pressure. He was the number one overall pick in a year that people wanted a number one center. And in a year where most of the models predicted that Shane Wright was going to have a much more lucrative, much more productive NHL career. And also, just in general, the Montreal Canadiens were looking for a number one center before Nick Suzuki became him. And so it's two different kinds of pressure. They play a largely different style. But I think that one thing that we do kind of have to remember with Max Pacioretty, he has a total of, I believe, 17 seasons in which he played in the NHL with varying degrees. Obviously, when he first made the NHL, it was only a few games, and then there were injuries, right? Like, he's Wolverine. He had some devastating injuries that he came back from. And in that time, he had, this is the thing that we often forget about Max Pacioretty. He had 6 seasons in which he scored more than 30 goals. And that's not something that, we can sneeze at, because how many of those has Montreal had in the lean years, let's say from the late 90s to now, right? It's not a whole lot of these kinds of players. And a lot of teams, they're drowning in them. Montreal has not. So to be fair, one of those, I think it was a 32 goal season that was with Vegas. But other than that, he had 30 or more goal seasons in the NHL for literally for the Montreal Canadiens. I also think it's a little bit disingenuous to kind of, I think at the time, we also considered Max Pacioretty. At first, he was like a peripheral player or peripheral goal scorer or whatever. And then it was like, well, okay, he's just a goal scorer and nothing else. It does kind of make sense, given that, with those 30 plus goal seasons, like the maximum point total he's ever had in the NHL is 67, right? He's never remotely, which is cool because that's his number, and he's done it multiple times, but he's never been that guy that we were thinking of when we thought, okay, superstar. Because when we were thinking of who we wanted to be the driver, especially on the top line, we wanted somebody who was, point per game player, and Nick didn't even attain that until last year. So by contrast, Juraj Slafkovsky has the maximum goals he scored is 20. That was 2 years ago. And the maximum points was last year's 51 points, right? Which is not something to sneeze at. This is his 4th year in the NHL. So we do kind of have to temper our expectations. And I think the biggest thing is that Juraj Slafkovsky does not do what Max Pacioretty does. Juraj Slafkovsky, sorry, it is late. It's been a long week and I'm doing this solo, so I'm tripping over my words. He's expected to drive his line, and he's been doing a magnificent job of it. Like when they took him off that top line, he was great on the top line. He was more of a beneficiary of the top line, not saying he did nothing. He had some amazing games, but he's truly, now that he's on a different line than, let's say, that top line, he's truly driving play. And we're seeing a dimension to him that we never saw before. And I think that it's fair to say that maybe, if we're looking at better, I don't know if it's a fair comparison, but if we say that Juraj Slafkovsky is going to become more impactful than Max Pacioretty, I would agree with that. I think impactful is a better way to put it, because it's not an apples to apples comparison, but it's not so far removed either, right? We're talking about wingers, we're talking about large guys, we're talking about guys who have the ability to protect the puck, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Lane Hutson is a totally different story because PK Subban, yes, he was extremely offensively gifted, and that's kind of where the comparison ends. The way that Lane Hutson plays is a lot calmer and a lot less physical, and generally he's wriggling away from hits rather than dishing them out. But I do kind of understand the comparison, and I think that, again, I don't know that it's going to be fair to say that he's going to be better than PK Subban because he's only been in the NHL for not even a season and a half yet. We're not even at a season and a third for Lane Hutson. But I do think that overall, the philosophical thing too is who the team surrounds these guys with. Number one, neither one of them is expected to be a savior. Lane Hutson is not here to be a savior. He's being surrounded by other players that will support that, like Caden Goalie, Noah Dobson, right? Like, why did the Canadiens go out and get Noah Dobson? So the way the Canadiens think is very different. And the same thing happened with Juraj Slafkovsky. Yes, he was the number one overall pick after a disastrous season. And I think the team tried to temper our expectations by saying, like, this is not a savior. Like, Juraj Slafkovsky is not here to save the Montreal Canadiens. And to a lesser extent, they didn't really temper it as much with Ivan Demidov, but they did kind of send that message. And I think that, I think the fundamental difference is that at that time, that PK Subban, Max Pacioretty were part of the core. Carey Price, I think the philosophy was very different. I think the way that the team acquired players or who they sought out was very different than now, right? And we're seeing that with their search for a center in the National Hockey League, which I will touch on a little bit later because there is another, it's a little bit of a tidbit. I just think that overall, these two players might have better careers overall than Max Pacioretty and PK Subban, but that's just because of the virtue of the team they're playing on and the way the team handles roster construction and their philosophy. Anyways, I thought that was a really interesting question. And yes, my friend did completely blatantly steal it from Reddit, but I just really liked it, the idea of talking about it. So I did accept that question. All right, up next, we're going to talk about whether it is time to hit the panic button, in particular with respect to goaltending, and we'll get into that right up next. This episode is brought to you by Monarch. Let's be honest, most of us can't even name all our financial accounts and let alone what they're worth. Between 401ks, savings, and investments, it's easy to lose track. And that can mean leaving money on the table. That's why I started using Monarch. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or on your phone. For me, the biggest thing was Monarch's visual dashboards and the smart tools made it so much easier for me to understand where my money was going. And I found out where my pitfalls were really that incidental day-to-day spending, the little treat culture that I was falling for. And Monarch makes it easy to see it and kind of visualize as well, like how you're going to be able to reach your financial goals faster if you take care of that kind of spending. And honestly, Monarch has changed my life. As for you, do what I did. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarch.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarch.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. All right. It is time now to talk about when to hit the panic button. This also came from an IRL friend of mine, not a work friend at this time. And this is actually, it wasn't technically a mailbag question. This was really, I wasn't even asked to discuss it on the show. I just thought it was worth talking about. My friends obviously know I do this, and they ask a lot of the time, like, how's it going? What should we do? Should we be worried? And the question was specifically, when is it time to hit the panic button on the goalies? And I think if you're a Montreal Canadiens fan, you've done it already. You have already hit the panic button on the goalies. For the Montreal Canadiens, it's a little bit different because what's available and what's out there is not necessarily an upgrade on what you already have. And I do think that even though I did say, like, if you're a Montreal Canadiens fan, you've already hit the panic button, I do think that Jakub Dobes is starting to look a little bit better. I had the goalie stats pulled up because each goalie has so far only played 12 games in the NHL. And let me give you their stats. I had pulled them up, and then for some reason I let it go. They have each played 12 games. Jakub Dobes has 8 wins, 2 losses, and 2 overtime losses. Not terrible. Obviously he took it very hard, but it's really not bad, right? And then Samuel Montembeault has 4 wins, 5 losses, and 1 overtime loss. So not necessarily encouraging. And I think watching them play also has been a little bit discouraging. I do think that their body language has looked off at times. I think in the Utah Mammoth game, towards, I think I want to say the second period and through the third period, Jakub Dobes started looking more and more confident. I know that second period wasn't great for the Montreal Canadiens overall. We talked yesterday about how you can't really fault them for, fault him, specifically for the goals that he allowed. But I think that I'm not panicking anymore because they have Jakub Dobes. Now, has he permanently stolen Samuel Montembeault's position as a starting goaltender? I don't know. I don't think so. I think that Samuel Montembeault is going to be okay. I just think that now is not the time. I think whatever's going on with him might take some more time to fix. On Locked On Columbus Blue Jackets with our good friend Jay, we talked about Sam Montembeault a little bit, and we just kind of talked about how he has the yips, right? And if you're a Ted Lasso fan, you know the story about the yips. And I've long said that Samuel Montembeault's current issues are between the ears. They're not a physical issue. We do have our really good friend Dylan Waugh, goalie coach. Also, if you remember, he had a podcast called The Habs Statistician, a very popular podcast. He's a very, very busy man, but he is literally a goalie and a goaltending coach. And I really trust what he says about goalies. And specifically, he was right about Caden Primo. He was pretty positive on Dobes as a backup. So we are going to get him on to talk about goaltending. The Canadiens have a very weird schedule coming up, and he's also a very busy person. So we're going to try and find a way for an episode. And I also I didn't want to do this episode without Ian. I really wanted Ian to have the chance to pick his brain as well. So we are going to have him on at some point. Speaking of the Canadian schedule, there is a back-to-back this weekend, and then there's another back-to-back in the middle of the week, and then there's another back-to-back next weekend. This is the Montreal Canadiens schedule for the next week and a half. So it's a little bit tough. And I don't know if I'm a big fan. Amongst those teams, there's St. Louis, there's Toronto, but then there's also Vegas and Colorado starting today. So it's a lot. But let me just circle back on that goalie panic button thing. I think we've all kind of hit the button. I think that we all kind of need to calm down. I think everything's going to be okay. It's just very inopportune for it to be happening at this moment when the standings are really tight and the difference of an hour can put you in or out of a playoff spot. I do think the Montreal Canadiens are going to be fine. I think at the end of the day, the front office can be trusted to do something to fix this. One of the things that, they are probably looking at is available goaltenders. I also think that they're looking at other positions to shore up. Speaking of those other positions, the Montreal Canadiens do have their eye on Ryan O'Reilly, but the price from Nashville, I know it came out a few days ago, but we haven't discussed it here yet. The price from Nashville is a pick and an A-level prospect. And I think that that's a little bit steep right now for the Montreal Canadiens. I completely understand why Nashville wants to do that. I just think that it's a bit steep for the Montreal Canadiens, and maybe another team might pay. But I do think based on Pierre LeBrun's, I believe it was Pierre LeBrun on Insider Trading, he said that Ryan O'Reilly is pretty high on the Montreal Canadiens list. It does make sense. He's serviceable. He's got term. He doesn't have a no-move clause, and he has a reasonable contract. He's also, unlike Steven Stamkos, who the Predators are also shopping, I think Steven Stamkos is way past his prime. I don't see a resurgence from him coming anytime soon. All right, up next, we're going to get into some more questions. We have some fun stuff, and that's coming up in just one moment here on Locked On Canadiens. This episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of the game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. And honestly, when it's not your team also, it really does bring you closer into the game, brings you closer to the action. It makes you feel like part of the action. So right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. I'm going to say that again. It's $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, it is now time for the rest of our mailbag. We've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to fire through them as quickly as possible. I also do want to mention there is trivia at the end of this episode. My co-host is off, but there will be trivia. All right, our really good friend Amelia asks us, what's with the dumb narrative of Montreal is so stupid, they gave us Heineman as a throw-in and he's awesome? It's very puzzling to me. Is it just hot takes / strawman nonsense? I think people loved him, but the trade was worth it for Dobson. So I think that the Montreal Canadiens did really good with that Dobson trade. However, I wouldn't call it a fleecing because the Islanders got 2 great picks plus Emil Heineman. He was not a throw-in. He was part of that package. In order to get Noah Dobson, the Canadiens had to offer a really strong package in return. So to me, like, Emil Heineman is not a throw-in. He is part of the package. Now, if it's Montreal Canadiens fans saying things like that, I understand that the bottom 6 right now is not as good as the bottom 6 from last year, but the Canadiens are trying to fix that. I don't know if they're going to succeed, but at the very least, they're aware. They are open. They are clearly with it. They're clearly trying to do something about it. So if it's Islanders fans saying that, I think it's a little bit revisionist history. My co-host pointed out a couple of weeks ago that maybe they just didn't really appreciate his game while he was there. And so it is revisionist where, like, they don't think that Noah Dobson is as good as they think he is. But, like, for me, Emil Heineman was like a good piece. I think the meat of that trade was not just the picks, it was a roster player as well. And he's fantastic. Honestly, the Canadiens traded for him, right? Like, he gets traded for a lot. So Emil Heineman is a great player. I don't think the narrative is that Montreal was stupid to let him go. I think that they really wanted Noah Dobson. They got Noah Dobson for a contract that they were happy with as well, a palatable contract to Montreal. And so you got to pay for that. And Emil Heineman was a piece. Speaking of Emil Heineman, one of the people that pointed out how good he was very early on was our good friend Patrick Bexell of Habs Eyes on the Prize. I almost said of Locked On Canadiens, of Habs Eyes on the Prize. And on Habs Eyes on the Prize, he has an article. It came out on the day that I'm recording this episode, so it will still be pretty high up when you go there. Go to habseyesontheprize.com, and there's a feature on Adam Engstrom's summer preparedness. When Patrick was on this show just before the season started, we talked about Adam Engstrom. We talked about Adam Engstrom's summer preparedness, and the article is there. It's fantastic. It really goes in depth, and he talked to a lot of really good sources, well-connected sources, to put that article on there. So definitely check that out. Patrick Bexell, habseyesontheprize.com, an article on Adam Engstrom's summer preparedness. All right, next question. Edgar asks, what was the choice of Putin that Ian was not able to try during his visit to Montreal? The one that lost his eventual choice. Well, Ian was smart enough to get 2 poutines when he was here. So he and his wife went to Ma Poule Mouillée, just like everyone yelled at him to do. And then they also went to La Fleur to get like a classic Montreal, with the steamies and the poutine. So there was no poutine that lost his eventual choice. Although I think, in fairness, he was here long enough to have maybe 6 or 7 meals, and only 2 of them were poutine. So maybe we can question that. So Ian, speaking of Ian, he asks, if you were a dish on the Thanksgiving dinner table, American or Canadian, what would you be? And then our good friend Anthony responded, revenge, because it's served cold. But I think for me, I'm going to go with mashed potatoes. Now, mashed potatoes might seem boring, but my aunt makes one with 3 kinds of potatoes: sweet potato, yellow or white potato, and then red potatoes. And she mixes them all up, and she uses ground Sichuan peppercorns, not a lot, just a little bit. And I think she makes it in some sort of mushroom broth or a chicken broth. But anyways, it is fantastic. It's so good. I would be that. And I do recommend you do that. So you're going to boil your potatoes in the chicken or mushroom broth. I really like the mushroom broth, but your mileage may vary. And then you're going to use ground up dried Sichuan peppercorns, not like regular peppercorns, although you can do that too. A little bit of salt, little bit of butter, and your 3-color mashed potato. It's going to come out looking orange anyway, but it's so good, and that's what I would be. And then we've got a couple more questions from our listeners, where Kay, our good friend Kay, who, speaking of Kay, Game Over Montreal, Ian is going to be on Game Over Montreal after the Colorado game on Saturday. It is a 3 p.m. start. It's going to be kind of like an early evening Game Over hangout. So yes, that check him out there. I could not join because I had other plans, but I am definitely excited for him to be on there. So Kay asks, who's a guy that you'd love on the Canadiens? Someone realistic in that he'd be available and attainable, but won't happen or doesn't make sense because there's no spot on the roster for him. For example, maybe a young mobile left-handed defenseman who would cost too much to justify not using one of our 100 left-handed defensemen. It could even be about the style of play that he has. Okay, so I don't think that this guy's realistic or available or attainable, but for a long time I wanted Zach Werenski to be a Montreal Canadiens defenseman. I really think that was like kind of like this guy would fit, right? And then he went and re-signed with Columbus. But a realistic guy that might be available or attainable, that one, like for me, is quite tough because I think that it might be a team that won't trade with the Montreal Canadiens. I think that like there's a lot of factors and stuff that go into play, but I do think that Bowen Byram is somebody that I would love to see on the Montreal Canadiens. And when I say realistic and attainable, I think it's just because the team he's on, it makes it realistic, kind of forces. Our good friend Adam Yu asks, and this is like from last Saturday, but I think it still applies. After the game against the Capitals and the debate about the lack of pushback from the hit on Evans, we saw Florian get called up. I'm not suggesting there's any kind of rift between Hughes and Marty, but how likely is it that Hughes looked at that game and talked to Marty about the need to push back physically and sent up Florian? I think overall, I think they are in alignment. I don't think that there's any kind of disagreement. I think Marty also felt that there should have been more pushback, but he's not going to throw his players under the bus when the media asked about it. I do think that he probably felt that there should be a response, right? And we saw, not just with the insertion of Florian Jacquet, but we saw again in the Mammoth game too, where the Montreal Canadiens are not letting things slide. So I do think that we're not going to have to worry too much about the response from the Montreal Canadiens. I think they probably got a talking to. And I think Florian's call-up was very well placed for that day. I think that was the perfect game to do it in because the Canadiens needed a spark. I think less than a response, they just needed a spark. And that was really, for me, the reason they called him up. So we've got our friend Alexander G asking us, hi Laura, you've talked a couple of times about going to watch the Victoire. Is there a great source for following the team like you guys are for the Habs? I've tried to watch most games since the first season, and I've gone each time that they've come to Boston, which means I'm really sick of Aaron Frankel. But other than Jared's great coverage at Eyes on the Prize, I don't know where to read about, listen to stuff about them. Are there other great places? Either language works. So I have yet to find, other than Jared, somebody who specifically is fully dedicated to only covering the Victoire. The Victoire, pretty good in general, like with their dissemination of information, but there are a lot of sources for women's hockey or sports in Montreal that are my go-to. So for women's hockey, there's the icegarden.com. And they cover women's hockey as a whole. The PWHL is a big focus of their coverage, and they do talk about Montreal. Here on the Locked On Podcast Network, the Locked On NHL on Fridays has women's hockey check-ins. So the PWHL, all kinds of things there. So we do cover it here as well on our national show. And then in Montreal, I find that the French language sources have been a lot more prolific on the Victoire. So the Journal de Montréal, as much as I know what we think of the Journal de Montréal, and sometimes it sensationalizes some things particularly to do with the Habs, but they do cover the Victoire pretty well. And La Presse also does. And then I think it's 98.5 FM. They also do cover the Victoire. So again, I haven't found a source that's like exclusively on the Victoire beat that I that I will listen to, but I will look in all of these places for Victoire information, if that makes sense. Now, if you're a listener and you follow the Victoire and you have better sources, if you know of a podcast or something like that, that is really focused on the Victoire, please let me know. Like, the fan base is so strong and so dedicated. Like, the Victoire fan, like, honestly, like, being at the home opener, I got chills because the entire crowd knew how the announcer was going to say the player's name. Like, we've been here a long time, or they've been there, night in and night out. So there's going to be dedicated sources. I just, I go to the mainstream. My default is to go to the mainstream. So please, listeners, let us know, and we will share our Victoire sources or your Victoire sources with our listeners. All right, that is it for our mailbag today. I'm going to get into trivia. So yesterday's trivia question from my co-host, I did have to write it down because I wanted to get the order right. So yesterday's trivia question was, which former Hab, Duck, Blackhawk, Oiler, Coyote, Jet, and Leaf celebrated his birthday on November 27th? The answer is Chad Kilger. And we had a few listeners that got that answer right. And we always shout out our listeners who get the answers right. And today we had our good friend Super Rain. We had Kyle Roberts, and we had David Waddy, who got the answer correct. Chad Kilger. It is apparently his 49th birthday. Thank you for that information, that additional information from Kyle. And today's trivia question, I wrote this myself. It was inspired actually by Super Rain's suggestion for a trivia question. But I kind of used his, and then I appropriated my need to remember a dude. So the 1994 Olympic ice hockey champions. Now, remember, at that time, there was no women's hockey. Women's hockey only came in Nagano in 1998. But in 1994, the Olympic ice hockey champions, the championship team, featured 3 players who have played for the Montreal Canadiens. One of them is a very obvious one, and the other 2 are dudes. Can you name all 3 players that were on that championship team who won the gold medal in 1994 and also played games for the Montreal Canadiens? Again, one is extremely obvious, glaring, but I want the other 2. I want to remember the other 2. All right, that's it for our episode today. I want to thank everyone who, bared with me for this mailbag, and I really, really appreciate all of you. And just to let you know, my co-host is coming back on Monday. We're going to be talking about the Vegas Golden Knights game and the Colorado game and setting up the week with that very weird back-to-back schedule. And in the meantime, you can subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. You can find us on social media. We're in Locked On Canadian. We are Locked On Canadians at TikTok, Blue Sky, and Instagram. And you can email us at lockedoncanadians@gmail.com. You can also leave comments in the YouTube for suggestions, mailbag to answer the trivia question, mailbag questions, all kinds of stuff. The best way to really get in touch with us is our Gmail, but please find us on social media. Please subscribe, tell your friends, follow us, interact with us. We love when you guys interact with us. It's honestly such a privilege to be able to talk to you guys, and it's all thanks to you that Locked On became the #1 sports podcast network. I really, really appreciate that. We all really, really appreciate that. So if you want to follow us, we're at Maybe It's Ian for my co-host, The Active Stick for me. I want to thank you all for listening, and we will see you all on Monday.